For this message, I'm going to start with something that I enjoy. Actually, a couple of things that I enjoy, and one of those is baseball. Now, I'm not a huge baseball fan, but I do enjoy baseball, and I know I'm going to catch some flack for this, but I think it's going to be a great idea to have the designated hitter in the National League. I'm already dodging tomatoes that people are throwing at me for that, but I know that's a thing, and I'm going to appreciate that. But normally at this time of year, we would be watching a lot of baseball around our house. Obviously, that's not happening right now, but we are hoping that maybe by the end of the month, things will continue to go well and that we'll actually be able to watch some baseball and watch some folks doing what they do so very well. Now, that's one thing that I enjoy. A second thing that I enjoy is that, well, you all know me. I like statistics. I love numbers and spreadsheets and databases, and I'm a nerd. I can't help myself. Those things I think, are a lot of fun. And what's really fun to me is when I can combine both of those things. Now, I don't remember if I've made this comparison before, if I've used it in church with us, but I really like the movie Moneyball. If you don't know what that is, that's a movie starring Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill, and it goes to the story of the 2002 Oakland A's. And it combines baseball, it combines statistics, and it combines a really just a crazy, incredible story of change and looking at things differently. That team of the Oakland A's had a few resources. It was struggling, and they needed to put together a new team. But they had to do so differently. They couldn't go according to the normal route because they couldn't afford any of those players. They couldn't do things like everyone else did. So they had to do it differently. Now, in the course of that, they managed to come across something that has changed baseball probably for a very long time. Now, if you aren't a baseball fan, that's okay. You don't need to be a baseball fan to understand where all of this is going, because it's not really about baseball. The story for baseball is just a great example to use. What's great about this movie is that it tells the story of guys who didn't just think outside of the box, but they took that box and they looked at it sideways. Because it's one thing to say you are an outside of the box thinker. Like, that's something that we hold up and say, oh, it's great to be able to think outside of the box. And that's good because it refreshes how we see things. But it's the sideways thinkers that really change things. Because it's not just then that they are looking outside of the box, but they are changing our perspective on what it is that we're seeing. Whether inside the box or outside, it doesn't matter. They're changing that perspective. Now, in the past, baseball was as much about things that you couldn't define as things that you could. It was often about the intangibles because they had so many statistics. In fact, I've heard it described before that baseball statistics are the only kind of statistics that most people need to know. And that works for at least as far as it goes. But because of that, there were also a lot of other things that you couldn't really define that baseball scouts would rely on when they were evaluating prospective players for teams and all of that. And so you had these guys, these 2002 Oakland A's, and they were in this problem. They were in this kind of hopeless situation that they knew that if they didn't do something completely different, that they knew exactly where they were going to get. That they weren't going to get anywhere. In fact, they were probably in the season farther behind than they already were. So what do we do when we get stuck in a place without an obvious solution? That's very challenging, that we aren't sure what we're supposed to do. Maybe we don't have a lot of familiarity with this, and so we know that we have to do things differently. What do you do when you see something that you don't understand? Now, have you ever done this one? This is one that I've done. I do this a lot. I look at something, I don't understand what's going on, I stare at it for a second, and then I kind of go, kind of turn my head at it sideways to get kind of a different look at it, because I'm just like, I'm really not sure what this is. Well, you also probably notice I kind of, when I look at it a little differently, we turn our heads so we see it differently. And because of them, baseball changed. They saw what was a hopeless situation and an impossible problem, and they made it beatable. Now, I could also take another nerdy reference at this coming from Star Trek, but I'll save that one for another time. See, this is the thing that prophets are doing, because this is really where I want to get to. It's what the prophets are doing. The prophets are doing this exact same thing that Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill were doing in the movie Moneyball. Because one of the things we have to get over about prophets is we assume that their job is to predict the future. That's really not their job. Their job is not future telling. Back in the day of the prophets, they had all sorts of people that could, or thought they could, predict the future. A lot like baseball scouts would evaluate talent to predict good ball players. Now, most of what they did, the prophets or the scouts, was based on those intangible things. Those intangible things that were a part of baseball for so long, those were the same things that were often involved in the prophets of their time. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't some of them that were really good at that. There were some folks that just have this knack that they don't really know they don't understand how they are doing, but they know that they are doing it and they're doing a good job with it. But the thing about it is that most weren't. We often get lost in the Old Testament thinking that there were very few prophets because we have very few of them that we talk about. But one of the things we didn't lack in the Old Testament were prophets. There were prophets everywhere. Prophets were a dime a dozen. Good prophets, though, good prophecy, that was much harder to come by. That took something different than what most of them ever had. And good prophecy did something that bad prophecy didn't. Bad prophecy would often focus on predicting the future. Good prophecy would focus on solving problems. And solving problems in unique ways that hadn't been tried before to try and beat those impossible situations that we all struggle with. Prophets of the Bible, that was their job. They were most important when Israel was in an impossible place. Their job was to look for the things that no one else was seeing and then try to get the people to go along with it. Now, they could do this because they were more in tune with what God was doing, intentionally so, than others were around them. And because of that, they could see things in ways that other folks couldn't. So let's first talk about, what do I mean when I say prophecy? Prophecy, this is the definition I like. Prophecy, I like to define like this. Prophecy evaluates the world around us with the intent to teach a lesson. Good prophecy does the same thing that the guys in Moneyball did. It looks at things in a different way so their problem can be overcome. Or at the very least, so that something can be gotten through. Because you know and I know that sometimes we can't solve problems. All we can do is try and get through to the other side, and that can be enough work in and of itself. Now today, we don't have a lot of prophets. We don't call them prophets. But we do have folks that serve a similar function. And today we don't call them prophets, we call them analysts. That's what prophets were doing back in their time. And so here's the thing. We like it eventually when someone moneyballs a problem. When someone takes that, kind of tilts their head, squints their eye a little bit, looks at things from a different perspective and comes up with a new solution that maybe hasn't been tried before, hasn't been tried well, or is just kind of radical and different. We call these people innovators. And when they're successful, when they're good, we hold them up in high esteem and we say they are incredible people and they do incredible things. But what we often forget is that these folks who do this, and this is the trouble with moneyballing something, with taking a different look at things, is that until they show success, we're going to fight them every step along the way. Because that's what we do. That's almost what we are conditioned to do. And until they can prove that they have something that is different and that works. Because look at baseball today. How you scout players today is very different from what it used to be. And it was a lot of fighting. When you watch the movie, you see the conflict that erupts between tradition and this new thing that is happening. Because what's hard is that anytime we have to approach a situation and we are relying on prophets who are looking at things very differently, that means that things are going to change. That's going to be an inevitable part of this, is that things will change. The prophets were trying so very hard to get Israel to turn around and to fix things. I remember we've talked about this before, kind of where we are. Most of the time we have spent a lot of time in the southern kingdom of Judah, but right now in Amos' time, they're in the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, if you remember, Israel was the first of the two nations to be conquered. And so this is where Amos is. And as a prophet, he was looking around and knowing that things need to be fixed. He was listening for God's voice, and God was telling him, here are the things that need to be done. Here are the things that need to happen. Here's how this is going to work. And God was telling him that I want them to work, but things have to change. Amos could see the problems that were going on. And he was using the gifts that God had given him to do things differently. God was helping him to see the world in a different way. Now, he wasn't using statistics for this. There's a whole lot of other things that was going into what Amos was doing. Much like baseball used to always be big on numbers and statistics, but also all those big intangible things that you couldn't define. But if you can't tell a good story with those things, something that fits and that helps folks to understand the world around you and understand what's going on, then they don't mean anything. That means you're looking at the wrong things. If it's for baseball scouts, if you put all these things together but you still can't come up with a good baseball player, then all those things don't matter much. For prophets, if you put all those things together but you can't help folks overcome a problem, then it's really not very good prophecy. Amos was trying. Because when you find the right things to look at, and you tilt your head to that side and you gain a new perspective on things, that helps to overcome what is faced. If we look at things in that way, then maybe we can see the solution to the problem that we're facing. The Old Testament prophets were looking to God, but not in traditional ways. And in fact, many times they weren't looking towards God, they were looking towards other gods. But Amos comes along, and his prophecy is jarring. It is jarring to the people that heard it because he was telling them that home runs aren't a big deal. Home runs aren't nearly as important as you think they are, that there are other things that are more important that will help you to have a winning game and build a winning ball club. But when you do things that way, things have to change. And it's going to be different than the way that you were taught or the way that you want to do things. Because Amos was telling them that what you're doing is taking you farther away from God, and the farther away from God you get, the more trouble that you are going to be in. But Amos says, if you listen to me, let me tell you what will happen. Amos says, if you listen to me, we can build a championship team. And so he says in verses 14 and 15, I will improve the circumstances of my people Israel. They will rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them upon their land, and they will never again be plucked up out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God. For people that were, in Amos' time, facing being taken over by another empire, because remember, that's what they were facing. They were facing the Assyrians who were breathing down their necks. This was big because they were a real threat. But the challenge that Amos was coming up with, that he was facing with them, was that he was trying to prevent the people being conquered. And Amos was giving them everything that they needed. But the real challenge came. Could the people of Israel look sideways long enough to get through to the other side? That was the question they had to answer. Now we know how the story goes. The northern kingdom couldn't. They continued to fall apart. They continued to get in trouble. And in 722 BCE, they were conquered by the Assyrians. And they never recovered from that. They never came back from that. We've been talking about the return from exile, where the folks in Judah came back eventually. The northern kingdom of Israel never did come back from that. They couldn't do it. But that is a lesson also for us. Because we have a lot of people today that are trying to lead in different places, that think they are prophetic voices for our future, and telling us that if you do that, telling us that they are predicting the future, and they're telling us right where it is that we need to go. But far too often, what they're doing is they're just looking at a crystal ball. They're trying to predict the future. They don't really give us anything new to look at. What if we did like Amos did? What if we looked at what we were facing and we cocked our heads to the side and maybe squinted an eye a little bit and we gained a new perspective on things? Now, when I first preached this sermon a number of years ago, I had a very different list of problems that came after this that I thought we needed to kind of look at and gain a new perspective on, that maybe we could see God leading us into someplace different if we did that. But we live in one of those times where the world is being upended around us and there are no easy solutions. It's requiring us to look at a lot of things differently now and to make changes. And so some of these problems are, how do we combat a pandemic that seems to change every day? But the thing that has caused all of us, including the experts in the field who are now saying we need to do something different, they're saying it's something simple and it's something easy and it can have a major impact, but are we ready to do it? Are we ready to change our perspective and try something different? Something even just as simple as wearing a mask. Another challenge we face, and we have tried every other solution for this, is racism. What if we took a new perspective on it and we looked at it differently? What if we started from someplace different? Watch in the next couple of months as we begin a study on doing something exactly like that. What if we look differently at the role of police in our society, where so many things have been happening and so many things that we can't explain, good and bad both, and maybe in those moments we can say that maybe God is trying to show us something different, but we have to gain a new perspective on things in order to see what it is that we need to do next. Other things that we can take the same look at, we can take a look at what and who it takes to keep our economy moving as a nation. What about our schools and all of the things that we are expecting of them and doing, and how all of a sudden now they have become the front lines for what it is that's going to happen next in this crisis that we're in the middle of. Ongoing issues about raising families and childcare and all of the, there are too many issues inside of there to even get to all of them, and so many more things that in a time of upheaval require us to look differently. To look differently and see that God has been trying to speak to us, but we've been looking in the wrong directions. And maybe now it's time to twist our head a little bit, gain a new perspective on things. And remember the truth that Amos reminds us of, that the prophets remind us of, that God goes with us. That just because we don't always see God at work and the things going on doesn't mean that he isn't there. But maybe it means that we're looking in the wrong directions. And so maybe if we work to change our perspective, meaning that we're also open to being changed ourselves, then in that moment, then we will see that God has been there for a long time and is saying to us in that moment, finally, you are looking in my direction. When folks ask us how we find the answer to our problems through our faith, it isn't because we are good at looking up Bible verses and telling them a book, chapter, and verse to go look up. Quite frankly, that is the weakest way to try and help folks find that solution. Rather, it is because we get that God, through sending his Son, Jesus Christ, into the world, helps us to look at the world sideways and to see the things that everyone else is missing. So go out this week and do this. Look for what others aren't seeing and know that in those moments that God is already looking back at you. Take time this week to read through Amos chapter 9 and read through it several times and reflect on what's being said, but don't do this, because this is how we begin to look at this sideways. Read through there, reflect on that, but don't try to figure it out. That's the normal way of doing that. Instead, cock your head to the side, look a little bit differently at it, and let it sit on you, and let it work on you instead. Let those words figure you out first before you try to do the same. And in that moment, as that happens, know that God is speaking to you and that he is calling on you to go out and to be different, to do different, even in small ways, because now you're listening. Let us go. Let us be these people. Let us go and do this in Christ's name. Amen. invite you to take a few moments of some reflection and then join in singing our final song for today.